It's been a tumultuous time in US politics, to say the least. The Trump era is seemingly over. The Democrats now control both the House and the Senate. What will this mean for corporate America? With me to discuss that is Aaron Shapiro. He's Morningstar's head of policy research. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Now, in a recent piece, you mentioned that one of the big changes under the Democrats might be an increase in the corporate tax rate. What sort of effect do you think that will have on corporate America?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, as taxes go up, free cash flow goes down, and so the fair values, our fair value estimates, will probably fall a little bit as they rose. But I do think it's important to keep these things in overall context. Corporate tax rate was at least officially, there are a lot of deductions and loopholes and what have you, at 35% from 2010 through 2000. Well, further back, but certainly from 2010 to 2018, that wasn't exactly a period that was not economically dynamic in the US. And I don't think we're going all the way back to 35%. I think it will be a 6 or 7 percentage point increase off the current 21% rate. But yeah, I mean, taxes go up, cash flow goes down. So that's a pretty direct relationship.
Okay. And what sort of measures do you think the Biden administration will undertake? Where will they channel this money, do you think?
Yeah, so what we think is most likely is that Biden will have to deliver something on enhancing the Affordable Care Act. So there are a couple of ways to do that, and they're all pretty expensive because healthcare is pretty expensive. So, one way would be to expand our Medicaid program. So that's a low-income program to deliver healthcare. Another would be to bolster the subsidies that people get when they go and buy healthcare on the exchange market that we have. So we've estimated that those kind of interventions will cost somewhere between $85 billion and $100+ billion a year. Now, every percentage point increase in the corporate business tax rate nets about $100 billion over 10 years, about 10 billion a year. So you can kind of see why we think, somewhere in that 7 percentage point range, plus maybe a few other kinds of revenue raisers, would cover that sort of healthcare expansion. That's what we think is most likely.
Okay. Every day it seems that the market jumps or falls on the talk of COVID stimulus checks. But you, in a recent piece, are sort of arguing that has less effect. What are your reasons for that?
Yeah, when we look into this, I mean, we do think that that additional stimulus will have an immediate effect, but we tend to think it's just likely to pull the recovery forward a little bit. And that's because we're very bullish on a true V-shaped recovery once you get vaccines out and into people's arms. That's obviously something that the US has struggled with, but we do have 2 vaccines that are very effective. There may be more coming soon. And we think that's going to be the big driver of further recovery. And it's a lot more important than stimulus if you're taking a 2, 3, 4-year view of things.
One industry we've talked a lot about at Morningstar is cannabis, and that the cannabis stocks have shot up on talk of legalization under a Biden government. Are there any other industries and sectors that you think will benefit from the Democrats being in power?
Well, I mean, I do want to say on cannabis, I mean, a lot of that is because the Trump administration was pursuing, legal action where they could under existing law, although not as they could have gone further. I mean, some of the states, they could have said, we're shutting you down. You can't, legalize things. But I'm not sure it's that big of an inflection point from a legislative perspective. In terms of other industries, I mean, I think the conventional wisdom is generally correct that you're going to see, more enforcement, somewhat more regulation under a Democratic administration than you've seen certainly under this previous administration. But, when we've done a deep dive that will come out a little later this week. In general, when we really look at the kind of rulemaking we think is going to come out and the kinds of new regulations, we don't think it will be, particularly harmful to most industries. We don't think that most of these regulations will have a material effect on companies, and we generally don't think they're going to change our fair value estimates.
Well, let's turn to climate change in that case, because you think the probability of major new investments in clean energy is quite low. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, again, with only 50, with the narrowest majority you can possibly have, you have to sort of start looking at the median senator in the entire Senate, and the more rightward leaning senators in the Democratic caucus. And those senators, particularly Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Jon Tester from Montana, to maybe a little bit of a lesser degree, they're pretty skeptical. It's not that they're totally opposed to doing things that would mitigate climate change, but they represent states that are heavily dependent on traditional fossil fuels and fossil fuel, coal extraction and the like. And so, to sort of project that something, really big will happen there, given all the other challenges that Congress, has teed up for themselves. They're healthcare is a Democratic priority. They've pretty much locked into doing additional stimulus for state and local governments, but also just sending more checks to people. There's really only so much Congress can do in the sort of narrow window when they've just been elected and when they start running for re-election again. Mm-hmm. And just given that dynamic in the Senate, I'm pretty skeptical they'll be able to do a really big transformative things. Maybe some things around the edges. It's also worth noting that a lot of the kind of things you might want to do on climate change can't be done with 51 votes. They would require 60 votes. I'm not going to get into the arcane reasons around that, but that's definitely not going to happen.
And finally, at the top of this interview, I said the Trump era is seemingly over. Can the Republicans come back within 4 years, as they've been sort of talking about?
No, within 2 years. There are midterm elections every 2 years where the whole House of Representatives are up for election in the U.S. Traditionally, presidents lose seats, and the Democrats have a pretty narrow majority in the House as well. There's also a bunch of redistricting that's going to happen. We've been kind of trying to game this out. So Democrats are pretty vulnerable. The last president, with one asterisk, you have to go back to 1982 for a non-wartime president to have expanded his party's majority in the House of Representatives in that first midterm. And even Reagan didn't win the House back. He just picked up a few seats. Now, in 2002, Bush was able to expand the majority, but we were, 9/11 had just happened. It was an unusual circumstance. So it's very, very, very tough for a first-term president to expand that majority. Obama lost his majority in the midterm. Trump lost his majority in the midterm. That's what usually happens. That would certainly, you probably wouldn't go broke betting against that. Against the Democrats retaining their majority.
Any advice in this video is general advice prepared by Morningstar without reference to your financial objectives, situation, or needs. You should consider the advice in light of these matters and any relevant product disclosure statement before making any decision to invest.